Good evening, everyone. So welcome to this sixth talk in the UoH History webinar series. And today we have Professor Aloka Parasher Sen talking on remembering the past, writing history, the fragile archive. Before handing over the mic to Professor Aloka, may I request my colleague, Dr. Vijay Ramdas, to introduce the speaker. Vijay, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Professor Varghese. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar talk. A brief introduction about today's speaker. Professor Aloka Parasher Sen graduated with history honors from Lady Shri Ram College, University of Delhi in 1973 and continued her graduate studies between 1974 and 1978 at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London, where she obtained her PhD in 1978. Her teaching career spans over 4 decades, from 1979 till date, primarily located in the Department of History at the University of Hyderabad, where since 2018, she is Professor Emeritus in the Department of Sanskrit Studies. Her long tenure at the University of Hyderabad, Professor Parasher Sen has occupied several administrative positions. Most importantly, she was head of the Department of History between 1998 and 2001, Dean School of Social Sciences between 2013 and 2015, and Director of International Affairs from 2015 to 2018. Among her several academic assignments abroad, Professor Parasher Sen was a DAD Fellow at the Sudanese Institute, Universität Heidelberg, Germany in 1986, visiting professor and Fulbright scholar at the University of California, Berkeley, USA in 1992, and the first occupant of the rotating chair of Indian Studies at Universität Heidelberg, Germany in 2007. Professor Parasher Sen was also the first occupant of the Saroj and Prem Singh Mott Chair in Classical Indian Polity and Society between 2008 and 2011 in the Department of History at the University of Alberta, Canada. Professor Parasher Sen has delivered invited lectures and presented papers at the conferences in Canada, France, Germany, Hong Kong, Japan, UK, and the USA. Her major her major publications are in the main area of her interest in the social history of ancient India, namely early Indian attitudes towards foreigners, such as Greeks were referred as Yavanos. That was there in Professor Aloka Parasher Sen's works. Tribes and excluded caste, and different aspects of social, economic, cultural, and religious history and the archaeology of the Deccan, as is evident from her publications, notably her first book titled Mlachas in Early India, published in 1991, Social and Economic History of the Deccan, Some Interpretations, published in 1993, reprint in 2019, Subordinate and Marginal Groups in Early India up to 1500 AD, published by OUP in 2004, Religion and Modernity in India with Sekhar Bandyopadhyay, OUP 2016, and a forthcoming book titled Settlement and Local Histories of the Deccan. Coming to today's talk, in juxtaposing Remember the Past with writing history, Professor Parasher Sen will first interrogate the ways in which the ancient Indian intellectual tradition looked at memory, time, and history, so-called historical memory. This understanding, the speaker argues, impacts the construction of ancient sources, what she referred as a fragile archive. We used to write the modern history of ancient India. The lecture will weave together different terms from ancient sources, such as Ghada, Akhyayana, Purana, Itihasa, Vamsha, Sutta, and Charita, etc., used to describe the past, often loaded with memory. A variety of sources take their use and argue how there was an evolution in the way time was encrypted in key sources. Thus, each mode of history writing articulated for us the validity of memory, its legitimization or rejection in demarcating time, especially in terms of its relationship to the nature of history performed. I'm sure Professor Aloka Parasher Singh, by weaving these ancient sources, will explain to us how we can learn about the past. Over to you, Professor Aloka Parasher Singh.
Thank you very much, Vijay and Varghese, both of you. Thank you, all of you, for being here to join this conversation. I noticed that Bangeya has joined us, so thank you, Bangeya, for organizing these series, keeping us all busy and occupied. This is a good opportunity to connect with people whom we haven't met in years, and at least online we are able to connect with each other and maybe speak to each other, or at least get to learn about each other's work. So this topic that I've chosen, remembering the past, writing history, the fragile archive, though Vijay has given me a kind of a synoptic view of what I'm going to technically do, primarily keeping the students in mind, I wish that this topic also makes us think about larger issues that confront us, and that these are issues that affect all sections of the writing of Indian history, that is from ancient times to contemporary times. So I would like to, I would like to begin with a Harvard professor of history, American history, her interventions these days. She's called Jill Lepore, and as all of us in this pandemic, looking here, there, and everywhere for ideas and inspiration, thumbs up to Juhi Ahmed, who brought this site to my notice. This site is called The Last Archive. It's an audio show where Jill Lepore traces the history of evidence, proof, and knowledge in troubled epistemological times, namely our contemporary times, I mean, the epistemological times of the present. In doing so, she writes, and I quote, "How we know what we know and why it seems lately as if we do not know anything at all," unquote. Obviously, she's a professor of American history. She's looking at a contemporary scenario, namely Black Lives Matter and the entire movement around that. And she goes on to explain or expand the whole issue about evidence in history, where she puts in things like Facebook posts, blogs, and of course the traditional archival sources, inscriptions, etc., to say that this is how we create the historical record, and all that we write after that is about the scripts that we use. The script, as in the writing that we do, is based on this historical record. And this, we can talk about everything. We can talk about social movements, we can talk about economic history, we can talk about science and knowledge and everything based on this historical record. But she argues, and that is why we really need to have these audio recordings. In other words, she's privileging the oral as the real vis-a-vis the written, merely the written, because the written is available, except in some special cases. And so one of the first episodes is about the history of oral history of slaves. And she draws our attention to a novel, a very famous novel. Some of you may be familiar with it. It's called The Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. It is his own experiences about slavery and that of his family. And this was done in the 1830s. And at that time, there were major projects which were also about the whole question of how those people who had what do you call it, experienced slavery, how would their voices be heard? And so there was this archive that was created of oral histories. Now, these oral histories have since become a solid archive. Somebody is sharing the screen, which, yeah, okay, now that's fine. And so I found this an interesting intervention because it raises two questions for us. The first question that it raises us is that it is an interesting point in time in the 21st century during the course of the pandemic that this professor is raising these issues about real history being oral history, the voice of the people. And it also makes one look inward in terms of the fact that there are many people, many groups in society that are outside history, so to speak, in the sense that they don't have the written word to talk about their pasts. And therefore, there's something that we have to talk about section. We also begin to think people who don't have history, they don't have written records. That if we do this history of the oral, then are they solid archival material or are these fragile archives? And I want to proceed on this issue because though Jill Lepore is now privileging the oral, as far as India is concerned, we are compulsively an oral society. Our texts, which we use to write history, ancient history, they are not some kind of scrolls of the Dead Sea or something like that. They are actually remembered orally, except that we divide ourselves into two parts. We are outside history when we remember those pasts, and we are in history at the institutional site of the university. So there is this relationship that the text has, which in its origin was primarily oral, but now continues to be remembered as oral today, and the writing of history. So it's this contradiction, or rather it's this relationship that I want to explore further. And Vijay Ramdas has already told you how I'm going to proceed about doing this. I will first talk a bit about the question of memory, time, and history in quotation marks, within the Indian intellectual tradition, and then move on to different words that we have that describe the past. And primarily, most of these words, take any Indian language, are actually talking about the past based on memory. At what point in time some of these ideas get written in inscriptions and so on and so forth? I'll come to that as well. But primarily, the way memory is connected with how time evolves, how the notion of time evolves, is also how history is written about. And so this connection between memory, time, and history is something that we need to interrogate. And ultimately, I have a very simple question, and maybe we can discuss that further in the question and answer, is that do we look at the past of ancient India in a unilateral way, after all that I have discussed? Now, as I said in the beginning, that some of what the practitioners of what we call ancient Indian history, in terms of how do we use our sources, we want it to be confined to merely that. I want it to be also, it's a question already posed by me, how do we write history societies, whether in the past or in the present, who primarily remember their past? And there are a large number of communities and societies that remember their past and think that the memorizing of the past, think that it is related to not only ethical issues. So this is something that is very real. It's not an imagined world. There is a real world of people who remember their past. And therefore, this validity of memory to demarcate time, as is embedded in these texts, is something that we have to address. Now, we usually call this literature, right? So there is this terminology, literature, that we use to look at these texts which were overloaded with memory, but we have now created this genre of literature. Just in passing, let me mention that for ancient Indian history, there are, of course, other sources of information like archaeology and inscriptions, numismatics. Give us one noting that we associate ourselves from memory in all this artifactual material that we have. I mean, suddenly I'm drawn to, in Mamalapuram you have the Pandava Rathas, or you have the descent of the Ganges, or you have various visual representations of what is embedded in Itihas all over the country. There's one instrument. Secondly, most important of all, which I may dwell on a bit, in inscription, Itihasic, Puranic kind of tradition, that is made part and parcel of what are called the Prashasti sections of the inscriptions, but nonetheless, they're integral, right? So, numerous, etc., etc. But the overall conditioning of how we look at the remembered past, in some way or the other, negotiates with this remembered past. Now, let me define literature, and I'm drawing upon a very well-known Hindi writer, Agay. Some of you may know him as S.H. Vatsayan. And he writes, and I quote, "Literature as a product of the whole culture of people at a certain time must necessarily reflect the cosmology of the culture at that time. Also, the self-view or identity of that people at that time. The cultural significance of even the most direct experience of an individual, but a multi-layered, multifaceted complex determined by more than one coordinate of time," unquote. Rather comprehensive definition. As a creative writer, he has, of course, we know from his other writings, delved deeply into the way we as a society identify ourselves and so on and so forth. And so therefore, it sort of drives me, it makes me want to really go deep into this whole question of how should we understand memory within the context of how we are as a people. Now, on the face of it, memory and history are antithetical. I mean, they are in, we look at them in opposite camps, but actually it's not so dramatically different. They're not so dramatically different. I mean, and I'd like to show you how, because in the way in which they are selective, memory is selective in some ways. History is also selective because history is actually dependent on whatever has survived. So by default, it is selective. There is, of course, one major difference, as I said. Remembered cultures do not write or primarily are oral and continue to retain that element of orality, while history must compulsively be written. And this reminds me of, in more recent times, that is when I talk about ancient India, the 20th century is recent times, the book that was published by the French writer Pierre Nora, that is called Les Lieux du Mémoire. And this was translated much later into English, and then of course it created quite a hue and cry. In fact, in 1989, there was a special issue of Representations, the UC Berkeley journal that comes out that devoted the entire issue to memory and the writing of social history. And of course, you will remember, those of you who know Pierre Nora, of course, this was the whole question of the memory of the Holocaust and how when there is this helplessness of getting the archival record, then the experience and the memory of the Holocaust becomes a viable way in which one can write history. But in traditional cultures, on the other hand, there is no effort. In traditional cultures all over the world, there's no effort really to write down memory because this memory is continuous and this memory has a relevance to the society that is remembering that. In fact, I should tell you over here that when memory is valid, it is based on the community's acceptance. Whatever is that community, the community's acceptance is important. That is the data for memory. But for history, we must have scientific data that is available, verified, non-problematic, and so on and so forth. But when history begins its task, history is the sign of the modern. Nicholas Dirks tells us that. And as a sign of the modern, it is also the sign of the nation state. And in that sense, history is very selective in reinventing official memories. It's celebrating collective pasts, but these collective pasts are through the prism of official memories and national regenerations. This is a very important element. Of course, one could go down further and say this is also something to do about regional regenerations or provincial states and so on and so forth. So memory, in a sense, looks at reality of the past as much as possible. It doesn't lay claim to having looked at the total past, whereas history endeavors to find truth. And these days, of course, historians worry if is it possible at all to get the truth, or are there multiple truths? Okay, these days, if you really are concerned about having a more pluralistic approach to writing the history of various social groups, then you are concerned about multiple truths and so on. But in any case, it is the endeavor to find truth if it is possible. Now, before I move on to history per se, I just want to say a few things about time in human thinking. And it's well known that when humans realized that the past could be captured through memory, then they began to manipulate time. But however, the development of writing brings about the notion of conquering time. So in a sense, history creates a kind of artificial memory where the created experience of thoughts of human beings who are long dead has to be memorized. So there is a kind of conscious attempt to create an artificial memory out of by manipulating time, or rather by conquering time. The famous mythologist, if one can call him that, Marcia Eliot, informed us when he studied his ancient myths that we need to differentiate between mythical and sacred time and what he called profane time. Because profane time was a continuous time, irreversible time, and this was about our everyday existence. So this is a valuable distinction between different kinds of time, but I would add in between here, in the Indian context, and I'll come to this towards the end of this thing, about ritual time as well, because ritual time has got a lot to do with the way we organize our society. At a philosophical level in India, we've had very many debates, and I don't want to go deep into them, about whether time is a creator or is it created? Is it subjective or objective? Is it real or unreal? Is it physical or psychological, and so on? But there's one thing about these debates that I must point out, and that is that given the fact that time is linked to the all-pervasive cosmic being in the philosophical traditions, which is always cyclic and dynamic. It's never dead. It's always dynamic. It determines the birth, the subsistence, and then the destruction of the universe in this understanding. And therefore, all empirical beings have to be under this rubric of understanding time. And of course, some of you are familiar with tantric writings, and I've written something on that, so I'm just drawing on that. There is Kal and Mahakal. So I would look at Kal and Mahakal as not the end and the beginning, but rather as understanding of the transformative nature of the human being, because there is an element of continuity from the end to a resurrection or to a new beginning, and that is transformative. So there is a kind of cyclic way in which time is understood in this. It is in other words, it is intertwined with a transcendental understanding of the past. Now, if those of you who have read Ashish Nandi's 1995 Histories, Forgotten Doubles, he says how secular historians are very allergic to this transcendental notion of time, and they reject this and they put this in the category of ahistoricals. Now, all these ahistoricals have to be bought into history, he argues in that paper. Now, there's another scholar whom I draw upon, who has primarily looked at, because I haven't looked at these philosophical texts, so I'm looking at scholars who have. This is Roy Perrett, who wrote an interesting article in 1999 on history, time, and knowledge in ancient India, where he has argued that both history and memory, both history as well as memory, had a status of denial in the Indian psyche. And what he means by that is that in the philosophical traditions, memory was considered faulty because it gave no new knowledge. It only remembered what had happened. And even if it remembers something new about an object, it could only be authenticated with memory. And therefore, memory is just about embedded in past experiences. And it does not in any way tell us about a true or real object. In that sense, if I have to, interpret from this, when we draw upon memory, we are really drawing about the present. We only reflect on the past to understand the present. And this is a very important role of memory. And we don't have to put memory into the dungeons of the past as so some distant, sort of really, really past of antiquity and so on and so forth. But despite these philosophical denials and so on and so forth, I want to place before you three different notions of memory that one has been dealing with or have been dealing with, and these are well known for historians who work in ancient Indian history. One is the itihas or collective memory, which is loosely translated as history, and that's why always one has to put history in single quotation marks here. The second is called smriti, which is the cultural memory and the rule-boundedness of Indian society. And the third is samskara, or the subliminal impressions produced on an individual's mind by past experiences, mental or behavioral, and they are only retained by her or him. And all these three differentiated time. So when you talk about itihas, you're really talking about a country or a larger entity like a region or a nation or some large entity. When you talk about smriti, you're really talking about a social group or samaj as articulated in these traditions. And when you talk about samskara, you're actually talking about the individual. Now, all these three are fostered and written about in the ancient Indian texts. And I would state over here that there is an interrelationship between the individual, the society, and of course, the entity, the larger entity that there is. Professor Thapar, in Time as a Metaphor of History, pertinently emphasized that cosmological discourses do not necessarily exclude one or the other category of reckoning time. In other words, the cyclic notions and the linear notions of time can simultaneously coexist, indicating the centrality of history in such an understanding. And I would say over here, it is problematic. The centrality of history is problematic in this, in this trying to put cyclic as well as linear notions, right? It just complicates the whole issue of how an individual or society or a thing can really talk about history the way we understand it today. I would rather put this as perceptions of the past vis-a-vis the worldview that adopts linearity alone. In other words, what we do as history really looks at linearity and therefore has no space for these perceptions of looking at cyclic notions and not at all bothered about the individual's relationship with its collective past. That's not the concern. The individual as well as the entity has to be part of this linear understanding of the past. Now about itihas. Everybody knows what it really means. Thus it was, so it has been, etc. But something about the occurrence and genealogy of this term. So the Puranas, of course, are very clear about the fact that it is about remembering the past. Nowhere do they say that this is an authentic writing of the past, or nowhere do they say that this is an authentic understanding of the past. It's just about remembering the past. It occurs as a word in the Rig Veda when there is the story of the gambler's lament, but there's not much written about that. The two words, itihas and Puran, occur in the Atharva Veda, but are not given much sufficient importance. It's only in the Upanishads, very interestingly, that the Itihas and Purana are looked at as the fifth Veda. And here I would say that when we say Itihas over here, it's probably referring to the epic, that is the Mahabharata, wherein the Mahabharata is also referred to often as the fifth Veda. But the interesting thing about the Upanishads, especially in the Chandogya Upanishad, is the question of using the word Itihas, Puran together. And why do I say this? Because when we translate what is said there, it simply means the reading of old stories. Now, why I emphasize on Itihas Puran together as a way of remembering the past is because I tried very hard to get an individual word for mythology and an individual word for history, but I find different words for history, as I will argue, and there's no single word that we can actually, in Hindi we use mythika or kalpita myth, etc., but you don't really have a word which we can appropriately translate as myth. So Itihas Puran is a combined way of looking at where within Itihas Puran there's mythology, there's narrative, there's genealogy, and there's legend. There is a kind of a, sort of everything put within this. So this is, I would say, encapsulates a way of looking at the past, which entwines all these things. And of course, there's an element of events as well. We'll come to that, how our events, they don't give too much of importance to political events. And at some time ago in the 20th century, political events were the backbone of how we should write history. But in this understanding, we don't have much importance given to political events. Now, what should we call this? Should we call it history or should we call it historical consciousness? And many historians prefer to use the word historical consciousness. Way back in the 1970s, Professor Amla Thapar, when she began to look at this tradition in a more nuanced way, used the term ancient Indian historical tradition and not ancient Indian ideas about history. And that's something interesting. And I'll come to this issue in a minute or two. The important point I would like to mention over here is that this historical consciousness is very different from the philosophy of history. That is the basis of the modern notion of history. So traditional India absolutely lacks the Enlightenment's concept of history. It finds objectivity a problem. It finds hard, reliable facts a problem. Most important of all, it finds issues about ethics or morality or ethical issues a problem. And in that sense, therefore, constructing the past on this firmness, on certitude, is something that is rejected, if one can say, in this way of looking at the past. Now, I think, therefore, at this point, we need to differentiate between different narratives of the past. I mean, I would look at history as one narrative of the past, but in decidedly different ways. And here I'm drawing upon Bernard Lewis, a book by the name Remembered, Recovered, and Invented History, where he defines remembered history as statements about the past that range from, I quote, personal recollections claimed by the elders to the living traditions of a civilization as embodied in its scriptures, its classics, and its inherited historiography, unquote. So this Itihas Puran that we are calling the collective historical consciousness is basically a society's inherited historiography, is what he tells us. And he goes on, and I quote, collective memory of a community, nation, or any other entity, what it or its rulers and leaders, poets and sages choose to remember as significant both in reality and symbol, unquote. I would add over here that there is an element of what Nandi had called principled forgetfulness and silence in memory. And this is a whole new issue that one can discuss again later on. Issues about what do you remember? Do you remember violence? Do you remember justice? Do you remember truth? All these issues about the human condition, etc. What does a community, what does a civilization choose to remember? The word being choose to remember, and that is why it is selective. And in recovered history, Bernard Lewis, of course, he's working on the Middle East. He's not working on India. He tells us about what the Orientalists and Indologists have done, even in India as well, about deciphering scripts, discovering monuments, carrying out excavations, which apparently the society that we are talking about, the collective historical consciousness, has forgotten about, or apparently don't know anything about. And then he differentiates this recovered history, or the process of recovering history, from what he calls invented history. And in this category, he puts down all modern interpretations of history, irrespective of whatever your ideological position is. Now, the crucial point for us today, for me today, is how were ancient sources constructed? Because within the framework of Indology, it's not just the monument or archaeology or the inscription or the script, it was also the construction of the literary sources. And these literary sources, once constructed, moved away from the ethos of those sources in one particular sense, and we can talk of others, that the text that the ethos that we were talking about was rather open, because it was continuously retransforming itself and in the present. In fact, you know, if some of you recall doing ancient history will remember that the Kali Age sections of the Puranas talk about the Kali Age in a future tense, bhavishyanti. It will be in the future. Actually, it's not in the future, it is in their present. But there is this very interesting relationship between the past, present, and the future. So once the ideological discourse comes in, you create fixed meanings. And by definition, these fixed meanings also become brittle over a period of time. And therefore, I talk about this brittleness becoming very fragile. Because once you have this brittleness over a long number of decades, when you're using all these texts as though they are these fixed brittle texts, then these become fragile over a period of time, because they are not able to talk to you about a large majority of the population that was not found in these, let's say, these canonized texts of the past, right? So there are a larger number of people outside. We realize there are a larger number of people outside these brittle canonized texts and so on and so forth. So central to this recognition, of course, you will all agree, and this most of us know about this, that modern history comes to us through the cultural baggage of colonialism. And as Inton has pointed out, this ideological discourse was told to us as being totally the opposite, actually totally the opposite of what the West was. And therefore, there was a search for rationality. In fact, the earlier Indologists like Louis Renou and all trying to look for rationality in the material that they were studying. But when they could not find any rationality, they tried to make the texts rational. And so Inton goes on to say that that voice denies the Indians the power to represent themselves and appropriates that power. Now, given this framework for the writing of ancient Indian history, one had to find those who were involved in this task had to find scientific, rational, positivist history based on these sources. But how? How should we go about doing it? Because all of them were rooted in memory, and this was something that was recognized by many. But how should we do it? So this takes me to the way in which scholars have read these texts. A bit of historiography here. In the early part of the 20th century, one of the first scholars who seriously engaged with this was a scholar called Frederick E. Pargeter, who wrote this book on dynasties of the Kali Age in 1913, where he tried to problematize the dynastic nomenclatures that you had in these Puranic texts. He also went on to identify their precursors in the Prakrit form, and then he tried to date them, because obviously the kind of magnificent dates that were given in the Puranas were not at all conducive to understanding linear time. So he tried to construct these, and subsequently published a book called The Ancient Indian Historical Tradition in 1922. So in the 20th century, or the first half of the 20th century, the endeavor was for historians to find history, to find empirical, logical, methodological understanding of these texts and put them within, largely at this point in time, a political narrative framework. And by the 1960s, C.H. Phillips, the director of the School of Oriental and African Studies, brought out this edited volume of they had a seminar there at that time, Historians of India, Pakistan, and Ceylon, and where for all research scholars, snippets of these sources were put into categories of how they could be used. These were historians of ancient. They were people who had written histories, right? So there are different kinds of passages and texts that could be used to write about the modern history of ancient India. And then, of course, in the 60s, from the Indian perspective, you had V.S. Pathak, who wrote historians, ancient Indian historians. And when he was saying ancient Indian historians, it was actually the content of the book was all about the biographers, the people who wrote Charita, not Itihas, but Charita. And these were actually kavyas. So if you would be in a Sanskrit department or a Hindi department, you would study this not as history, but as kavya, as ornate literature. And for southern India, you had Kailashpati, who brought out in 68 the Tamil heroic poetry in a similar way of trying to find history in poetry that was quite different from the modes of remembering the past in the way the historian. In the second half of the 20th century, orality began to be given some significance, especially after 1982 publications of Walter J. Ong's Orality and Literacy. And for India as well, back again at the School of Oriental and African Studies, Dawood Ali organized a seminar on invoking the past. And in 1992, a book of that name was published. And in that, there was a separate section called Beyond History. And in Beyond History, there was Subramaniam, Shulman, Michael Octor, and others who were talking about notions of memory and notions of smritis and other such things, which they categorized as beyond history. There was a very interesting, in the 1990s, as you can imagine, there was a lot of interest that emerged in thinking about how we should look at tradition, or how we should look at the traditional ways of understanding history, myth, and so on and so forth. And in the same volume, Invoking the Past, was a very fascinating article by Peter van der Veer, that is Monumental Texts, the critical editions of India's national heritage. And I'll talk a bit about that. And similarly, in 1995, you had that famous article I mentioned, Ashish Nandi's History's Forgotten Doubles. For medieval India, too, Ronald Linden and others brought out Querying the Medieval Texts and History of Practices in South Asia, again around 2000. And for the early modern period before the 19th century, the famous Velcheri Narayan Rao, Subramaniam Shulman, the Textures of Time Writing History. And here, of course, all of you must have come across that. Where again, they were interrogating different ways in which traditional societies tried to reconstruct their past. Of course, the culmination of all this was the 2013 publication of Professor Thapar's understandings of the ancient Indian historical tradition in a book entitled The Past Before Us, Historical Traditions in Early North India, published by Permanent Black in 2013. Now, I come to some of these just to critically raise the issue that these endeavors that modern historians of ancient India have done was to bring the so-called ahistoricals into history. So there were different ways in which this was done. About the creation of the critical editions, let me take that up first, because we are told that between 1860 and 1930, in the academy, there was this great fervent endeavor to create monumental texts, not only of the epics, but also of the Puranas and other such literary traditions, also the Pali traditions. And this was to create a logic and to create a logical, methodological way in which empiricism and positivism could be injected into these critical editions. So memory in these texts like the Mahabharata or the Puranas is now encased as a solid archive. And how is it encased? By cutting out interpolations. Now, I would argue that those interpolations were the ways in which this memory was actually bringing itself up to date to the present in which the interpretation took place or the translation took place, when it, of course, was translated into regional languages. So again, to quote Peter Van Der Veer, he says, if, I quote, if history and nation are only possible in the presence of the written, printed word, then it is quite understandable that the orality of Hindu traditions, Hindu traditions was a national embarrassment for Indian scholars, unquote. And what he's referring to in this section is basically Sukthankar, large passages from Sukthankar, who was involved with the critical edition of the Mahabharata, saying that it was really problematic to edit this Mahabharata because there were like, I don't know how many versions of it, and they were all orally transmitted. That was the problem that he faced. And similar problem that was faced by others who were undertaking these tasks. So we know even today, I mean, like the National Mission of Manuscripts and all tells us like there are 3 million unedited, untranslated manuscript-like texts that are available to us. So we know that the literary traditions all over the subcontinent were not unified. They were not homogeneous texts. They were compilations of disparate, often conflicting and regionally diverse oral and written traditions in one version or the other, and one version presupposed the other or contested the other. And therefore, these critical editions, to my mind, symbolize the very process of selection and unification, which was essential for the nationalist project. And please remember that this nationalist project was then lock, stock, and barrel adopted by the nation state, right? Then there is the second issue about interpretations that brings us to the contemporary impasse that we have in many regions, many areas of our understanding of the collective Itihasic chronic tradition. And that is, and here I quote Nandi, and I quote, the secular and Hindu nationalist historians share the belief that historical truths and the rectification of historical wrongs can only be solved by objective scientific history in modern India, unquote. So history is the terrain for which there is a fight. Both want to capture and correct it through the instrumentalities of the state. So it's not that the nationalist historians are fighting for the Itihas Puranic tradition. They are not fighting for that. They are fighting for a version of the scientific method that they use to create an archive. I forgot to mention in the critical editions, the Gita Press that came up. There's an entire book on the history of the Gita Press and the creation of textual traditions within the Gita Press understanding of the tradition. So therefore, they make an archive to find out historical truths from traditional texts and writings, which in their original were in oral, but through modern and postmodern textual analysis, they create a fragile archive. And this fragile archive, of course, then encounters different ideological interpretations. Okay, so you can understand that there are layers and layers of the way in which the fight for history takes place. And it's a fight for the kind of history that each one of them. So what about the worldview that created these texts? So let us move a bit into the terminologies that were used to look at the various ways in which the past was remembered. Now, in Thapar's understanding, and she's now done a very nuanced reading of this tradition, very different from what she did in the 1970s. And she says that her aim in this new book was, and I quote, to delineate the way in which the past is perceived, recorded, and used in early Indian society. Very important. Perceived, recorded, and used, and not explained. Its use, for what purposes, how, etc., becomes, of course, the content of that particular tradition. So she divides these into different categories. She uses the word embedded tradition. By embedded tradition means history is embedded in the tradition. So embedded tradition is the most ancient, where you have extant literary traditions of the Vedas, the epics, the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, And I would add over here the Shangam texts as well, the Sangam text traditions as well, and I'll explain that in a minute. Then she refers to the emerging tradition, emerging historical tradition, and this is the understanding of the Vamsha Anucharita sections of the Puranas, where there are ways in which dynasties are described. And then, of course, how this gets extended into the inscriptions. Very interesting. I came across a writing the other day about how the Jains also have the Puranas. And unlike the Hindu Puranas, the Jains have Puranas with authors. Usually the Puranas don't have authors, but here in this case, the Jains do have authors, and this is something unique to them. And then Thapar has a section called Alternative Histories. And she doesn't use the word alternative tradition here, but here she's focusing on the Buddhist historical tradition. And why not tradition and history is something also I'll elaborate on in a bit. And finally, of course, she uses the term histories of the tradition which are externalized. And of course, here she comes into the chronicles and the biographies, the historical biographies, and of course, the entire Jain ethos of historical writing in the king's courts and so on and so forth. Now, as I said, though we are familiar with Itihas and Puran, there are many terms in the what Thapar has referred to as the embedded tradition that describe the past. So, for example, the earliest word that you have is Gatha. And please remember that when I use these terminologies, I don't say that they are to be located absolutely in the past, because these are terms used even today to describe the past, right? So the Gathas, like the famous Indra Gathas, or the Naramshis, the great heroes, the human heroes and their tales or their stories. And then, of course, you have that unique mention of the Dasrajnya battle, the Battle of 10 Kings. These are all in a form that is referred to as embedded history. In the Sangam and the Sangam or Changam tradition in Tamil Nadu, of course, just like the Gathas, which are basically the songs in recitation of the heroes in battle, we must remember that these the historical context in which these hero songs were sung was a type of society that was a pre-state society. So in the Sangam tradition, you have the Akam and the Puram poems, and here also you have the Kanas and the Parayas and the Tutiyans singing in honor of these heroes who died in battle, and so on and so forth. So these are called embedded histories. So many scholars, as some of you know, have tried to identify Chera chieftains and Chola chieftains within this tradition, but the primary purpose of these Puram poems was to sing all small heroes, big heroes, etc., all kinds of heroes. And then, of course, there's the term Akhyayana. And Akhyayana is an embedded history because Akhyayana literally means a narrative and of the epic in prose or in verse. And this is often combined. Epic verse and prose are often combined. And this is where you have the great epics, the Mahabharata, the Ramayana. Of course, even in the southern traditions, you have epics of the Shilpadikaram, Manimekalai and all that. These are epics. These are like narrative styles talking about, well, events that happen, but that's not the only thing that they are writing about. The purpose is not history. The purpose is talking about conditions. And we can discuss that a bit later on. Now, about the Itihas, I've already discussed a lot, but one thing I want to mention is that when we refer to Puran, literally the word antiquity comes to mind. But here again, I want to emphasize that even though it's about antiquity, it's about narratives, it's also significantly about genealogies. I read somewhere that in the 19th century, when there were these genealogies of families that were discovered, these would have made fantastic social histories of the era. But these genealogies was converted into political histories in Bengal. But in a similar way, genealogies were very central to the Puranic understanding. And we talk about the Mahapuranas and the Upapuranas, and we talk about the great tradition. But actually, Purana is also a Sthala Purana, that is a local Purana. It's also a Mahatmya. It's also a Kula Purana, a family Purana. And we have to only look at Subachari's work on the Runchas and the other genealogists that he has written about, where the Runjas were professional genealogists in Andhra Pradesh who went seasonally from family to family to record the genealogies of these families. So Purana, in a sense, again, is not something to be located in 3rd century AD or the 2nd century BC or whatever. There is an element of continuity in the way in which the Purana mode of understanding the past continues. And of course, then there are Vamshavalis. And this is very important for compiling of these genealogies, because now these Vamshavalis are no longer, these are basically, they are sung in honor of kings, and these are now no longer done by the Sutas or the Panas or the Parayas. This is now done by the Brahmins of a particular category, the Bhrigu Brahmins, the Bhardwaj Brahmins, and so on and so forth. So this emerging historical tradition which Thapar refers to is really about the construction of these Vamshavalis. And finally, this gets culminated in the historical tradition externalized, because now when you have what is called the Akhyayika or biography, which is also called Charita. In many Indian languages, history is referred to as Charita. You have historical accounts of smaller entities, of individuals, and these are basically supposed to be biographical accounts, and they are written in a format of a kavya, of a literary text. And when scholars refer to Charita, they tend to ignore the exaggerated eulogistic nature of this history, because the purpose of that Charita was basically exaggerating the individual vis-a-vis the community. So can you see the difference between Charita and Itihas? Itihas is about a larger community, and Charita is about more about the individual. You have the Harsh Charita, the Buddha Charita, the first Ashwaghosh's 1st century AD. Then you have, of course, many early medieval Charitas, Vikramadeva Charita, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, there is a very unique historical account for the ancient period, which is called the Rajtarangani, and I'll come to that in a minute. But before that, let me turn to the alternative histories which Thapar referred to, and that is the Sutas and Mansas of the Buddhist tradition. I refer to it as tradition because what happens is that what is Sutta? Just as when we interrogate what is Purana or what is Itihas, we have to interrogate what is Sutta. So Sutta basically was the sermons of the Buddha. The Buddha is historically located, is a historical person. So how should it be read? So some people from within the tradition say that we should look for historical information in the Sutta, so that, of course, we all know that the original author of the Suttas was not writing an objective report. He was perceiving a certain historical situation, putting his own thoughts into the Sutta. However, when the Buddha Vachan becomes contested by various schools of the monks, you know about the various Buddhist councils and all that, there is a spiritual edification that is done of the Buddha Vachan. And then, of course, this becomes contestable. So therefore, history, which was supposed to be pure and simple historical information in the Sutta, gets contested, and therefore one is dependent on the perspective of the monks. And finally, then, of course, the Buddha Vachan and the Sutta is also used for institutional legitimization, and this tells us about the compiler's intention, the person who compiled the suttas together. So there are suttas during the lifetime of the Buddha, and maybe a little later. Then there are monks that retrieve the suttas, and then there are the compilers who begin to put these into order. So now these become, they are in some senses a way of looking at that past, which is also very different from the way the Buddhists looked at Vamsha or chronicles, that is closer to what we have in the medieval period, the chronicles, where the Buddhist attitude of the past was to gather a whole lot of relics, monastic records, royal records, shrines, legends, and put them into a kind of systematic order. The famous Deepa Vamsha, Mahavamsha, that you have, those that were written outside India, but within the subcontinental ethos. And these become historical didactic accounts of the Sangha, right? So in some senses, this way of looking at the past or remembering the past is different. Now let me pause a bit over here and sort of take you to the question of measuring time. Because when we talk about the genealogical sections, the Vamshavalis, the Prashastis, even the Akhyaikas or the biographies, we really have to talk about the question of how was time remembered, or how was time understood. Because here I would argue that there is an evolution in the way time is encrypted in these later sources. So this takes us to the development of the mathematical foundations of time in ancient India, which emerges in the Jyotish Vedangas between 300 to 200 BCE or so, around that time. The invention of the zero and the various Siddhanta treatises, where there are concrete calculations of time that are done, and the creation of a decimal system. So what are the implications of this? The implications of this is that time is now calculated in temporal terms, in understanding smaller fragments of time, and also defining political time. So whereas you are looking at the yugas, the Mahayugas, and the Kali Yugas, Treta Yugas, and the large notions of time, and then slowly those petering into linear time, here we are really breaking linear time into small fragments and political time. So the famous epigraphist D.C. Sarkar found an inscription in Gujarat, which he dated to the decimal 9 and 0 to the decimal correspondence of AD 595. But in 1993, there was B.N. Mukherjee and Acharya in the Journal of the Epigraphical Society of India that had two very interesting articles on looking at this whole question of when did the transition take place from regnal years to decimal notification. And B.N. Mukherjee says AD 789, and Acharya says it's the 10th century. He's looking at the inscription of the Soma Vamshis who had united different sections of ancient Orishan society, and therefore they needed this notion of particularly identifying their rise to power and their distancing themselves from the rest of the ruling elites. So in a sense, there are succession of moments of time that come into being as a result of all this. Now, when in the Puranas, the Kali age dynasties are described, there is, of course, a sequential order, but they are prefixed with some legendary, the Surya Vamshi, Chandra Vamshi lineages, and so on and so forth. But when you come to Prashastis, this is very different. Prashastis are ignored because they are these exaggerated eulogistic accounts. But in these Prashastis, there's a very significant element of real time, of the present of the rulers, which they call genealogical time, but then they append to that mythical time and, of course, legendary time as well. So they connect themselves to the Itihasic tradition by distancing themselves once again from their local conditioning to create an understanding of themselves that would make them greater and more powerful in the localities in which they were ruling. So civilizational symbols, metaphysical notions of the universal, etc., are all immediately put into. In any case, whether it is in Itihas Puran or the more recent, the biographical and the Prashasti traditions, both cyclic and linear times, they coexist. And we cannot forget the fact that even in the notions of linear times in the biographies, the same word is used for drama, the same word is used for novel, and the same word is used for prose biography, which we call historical. Now, I want to simply emphasize one single point over here. All these literary traditions, whether it is the biographers, whether it is those who are the compilers of the Itihas Puran tradition and so on and so forth, there is an excessive overload of trying to remember the past in different ways. You remember the past in different ways because it is very important for your present. So there is a constant going back to the present. And that is why when modern historians are so frustrated to use these ancient texts because they say that all these are interpolations. We can't really date the Mahabharata to this date or that date because there are these interpolations. How can there be interpolations? In fact, there are references in some Puranas to even Queen Victoria. So, I mean, obviously, these are not 3rd century AD Puranas and so on and so forth. So, moving away from all these kinds of texts is this Rajtarangani, which the ancient modern historians of ancient India emulate or try to project as the history of ancient India. Actually, it is the history of ancient Kashmir, the history of the kings of Kashmir, to be more particular. 1149 CE can be dated firmly. And this is Kalhan's family's association, who were very intimately related or closely associated with these families. But it's interesting that the first, but a very small section of this Rajtarangani does have a section on the mythical past from the Itihas Quran, but quickly moves into the second part, where he collects evidence from a variety of sources. And then, of course, the third part, which is the contemporary part, which gives causal explanation. It shifts from metaphysical explanations to rational ones, and then bases his entire account on secular empirical observations. Now, there is this big, huge debate. I think it's meaningless though. I mean, where did this historical tradition come from? Outsiders? It came from the outsiders. How did it come from the Greeks? I mean, the Greeks were familiar with this part of the country, but this was like 1,000 years before in northwestern India, from 1,000 years before the time of Kalhan. The Turkish tradition of Central Asia, but then, of course, this is rooted in an Islamic ethos, would be very different from what the Kalhan has done. It could probably be from the Buddhist traditions, but Buddhism was very strongly entrenched in this part, wherein it could have emerged out of the rationality of the Buddhist tradition in noting historical events and all. Be that as it may, it is also another way of looking at the past, wherein the issues of linear history get fructified in a text like the Rajtarangani. But be that as it may, there is yet another way in early India to remember the past, and this continues unabated. And I'm not going to go into the details. I'm moving towards my conclusion. And this other way of remembering the past is something that I would like to draw on Sheldon Pollock's early work, not his later work, where he writes, and I quote, "History is not simply absent." History by history, we mean the modern understanding of history. History is not simply absent from or unknown to Sanskritic culture. It is denied in favor of a mode of truth that accorded history no epistemological value or social significance, unquote. And here, of course, he's referring to the power of cultural memory as understood in the rule-boundedness of the Brahmanical discourse, commonly called the Smriti traditions of early India, and their umbilical cord relationship with Shruti, or the heard tradition, the revealed tradition, the memorized tradition. So this Shruti-Smriti relationship then gets re-articulated as a kind of genealogy of knowledge about the way in which rules have to be set for the way in which society is ordered. Sometimes the rules are fluid, but really cultural memory is about the record of human achievement built into the Vedic model of thought and action. Now, Michael Actor extends this argument, but makes a very important point about what is the notion of time that is encapsulated within the Smriti traditions. Remember that the Smriti traditions do talk about the four castes and the Varnashrama Dharma, but they also talk about Varna Sankaran, or the mixture of Varnas, which gives rise to Jatis. So you have innumerable Jatis all over the country, and the origins of these Jatis have to be located in time. So the production of this literature is also has to ritualize time. And in this sense, and I quote Actor, by dividing time into concentric scales from macro to micro units, from kalpas and yugas to days and moments, and by establishing connections between them, which become events of special importance, the present moment is placed in a history which is directly relevant to the present concerns. In other words, unquote, in other words, the present, the necessity of the present to rationalize the existence of these jatis within that larger ideological framework come into being. So this is another way of remembering the past. But this method of remembering the past is very different from what we discussed earlier, because this is capturing the past in controlling the present by creating a social order, which is of course hierarchical and necessarily unequal. And then I would like to intervene over here and suggest that there is something that happens within the Indian tradition as a whole, and that is encapsulated within the Purva Mimamsa traditions, wherein the Itihasic or Aitihasic mode is totally rejected in favor of what is called the Nairukta mode, that is Nirukta or meaning. So meaning that is generated within the tradition. Now over here what happens is that they open up texts. This also happens within the tradition, other texts also, whether it's the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, Manusmriti, everybody, all these texts are opened up by the Bhashyakaras or the commentators. And in the Purva Mimamsas, you have the two famous writers, Shabara and Kumarila Bhatt, in the 6th and the 8th century respectively, that talk about the critical role that the Siddhanta and the Purva Paksha readings of these texts happen. Those that agree and those that don't agree with the reading of a particular text. And this goes on because they observe different regional and cultural practices in their midst, and they have to somehow or the other come for an explanation to understand these regional and distinct local practices. This cannot be done with just applauding a unknown understanding of a remembered past. They have to make it rationalizable in the present, and this they do through the Nirukta mode. So in an overall assessment, what I've really tried to do for all of you is to sort of delineate the motives, rationales, and the narrative forms that we have for understanding the past, each one giving way to the other and questioning the other in a less structured way, but based primarily originally on memory. And there's also an interchangeability and connectedness to different notions of time. So that is, one merges with the other, so that both texts and inscriptions have both cyclic and linear notions of time in them. I would suggest that maybe linearity is important for political purposes, but the cyclic patterns become very important for cultural and social othering, and also for our philosophical concerns about life, about truth. I just want to say over here that, I don't know, as children, when we grew up, whatever, whether it was the Puranic stories or the Mahabharata, Ramayana, etc., and even in tribal communities and other, the Indian story is never conclusive. There's always something of a question mark that is put onto the story, and that sort of really raises the question about wanting you to question and wanting you to think about what should or what could have been the end. So it raises a lot of questions about the human condition, raises questions about violence, it raises a lot of such questions. So therefore, the cultural and social issues of othering, all these issues about the notion of the story have other ramifications, and not just, they are not texts for history. And therefore, there's no one mode of reckoning or remembering the past. And I would also say that one reckoning of the past doesn't erase the earlier one. So there is as I said, the Gatha can still be used as a way of remembering the past, just as the Purana can be. So maybe perhaps we can say that there were multipolar ways of looking at the past's historical reality, but can we really resist the temptation to put all these modes in a hierarchical way? Because we would look at them from a certain perspective of what we understand as historical explanation. I mean, I would think that this is too simplistic an answer, because objectivity and empirical stature of history is supposed to be about certitudes. Whereas these alternative constructions, as I have argued, myths, legends, stories, etc., they are about moral certitude. They are not about objectivity, about empirical certitudes, and so on and so forth. So then the question remains, why does the notion of history or the present-day modern notion of history want to use the latter, that is, these stories embedded, these fragile archives that we have constructed? Why do we need to use them? And I would like to conclude by two quotations, which I'd like all of you to think about. The first, and you'll guess whose it is, I will just read it out. To quote, the construction of the past, as in some of the little cultures of India, is guided not by memories alone, but by tacit theories of principal forgetfulness and silences. Such constructions are primarily responsible to the present and not to the future. They are meant neither for the archivist nor the archaeologist. They try to expand human options by reconfiguring the past and transcending it through creative improvisations, unquote. Of course, this is the end of Nandi's Histories Forgotten Others. The next is about, quote again, despite all the centralization and homogenization, variety continues to dominate. In fact, it is not helpful to posit a hegemony of the critical editions against forms of regional, oral, performative resistance. Orality insinuates itself, as Michel Ducerto puts it, into the network of scriptural economy, and it is precisely through the opposition between writing and speaking, between viewing and doing, that modern practices legitimate themselves, unquote. So I conclude that this does not demand of us to have a, and of course, by the way, the second quotation is from Peter Van Der Veer. So I would say that, I would conclude by saying that this does not demand of us to have a unilateral way of looking at the past reality, but instead one that is embedded in complex ways of looking at time, space, and the individual in a multi-layered society like ours. Where remembering, I would argue, is about openness and inclusion and not being written down into texts which cannot be opened up at all. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for the wonderful lecture. Sorry, I missed in the beginning. There was some problem with my laptop. But my goodness, I mean, the tone and tenor of Professor Aloka I have seen somewhere 27 years back is the same. So I'm really, thankful to you, for delivering this lecture. When so you have told us the various nuances of our Puranic literature, particularly, and the various issues we come across when we use them and all that. So really, it's a wonderful lecture. So now the lecture is open for discussion. Listeners can put down their questions and comments in the chat box. Ma'am, you can read from the chat box and respond to the listeners. Yeah, I have a small question as well. Yeah,
you want to start?
Yeah, I want to start. Yeah.
Okay.
See,
Okay.
Fact that there is a continuous attempt to rationalize Puranic literature from the Orientalist European Orientalist time, and there is, I mean, some kind of legitimacy. I mean, it's a legitimization of the Puranic literature, on par with archival or archaeological evidence as well. So I have actually a serious problem with the Puranic literature, which you also touched upon at the end of your lecture. This homogenization of Puranic literature. See, you have argued and written very widely on the diversities of Deccan and the specificities of various regions and all that. But I mean, as you know, this Puranic literature is basically Gangetic, valley-centric, and Brahmanic centric, and it has been imposed on the other communities and other regions as well. So my question is how to recover from this. I mean, so how to recover from this pan-Indian kind of structure, and and give some ideological integrity to the communities' identities and regions' identities, or something like that. So if you can comment something on this, that would be great.
Yeah, certainly, certainly. It's very good. See, this is precisely the problem of writing history. The writing of history has appropriated some versions of those critical editions of texts and used them to sort of talk about the country as a whole, the subcontinent as a whole. That's precisely the problem. They are not looking at, if we have to shift away from that pan-Indian perspective, one needs to shift. And of course, some scholars in the history of religion and other things have done that, is to look into the local Puranas, the community Puranas. Subhachari's work that I referred to of the Runjas and the local genealogists, rather than looking at these Puranic genealogists and so on and so forth. This needs to be done. I mean, the enterprise of history writing has not permitted us to move away from that nationalist project of creating these monolithized archives, which actually, in fact, are problematic, because the ethos of those very texts, which are rooted in memory, was not that. That was not the purpose of a Purana. The Purana was in a continuous stage of forming. There are the Kula Puranas, which are like written from a totally opposite perspective to the pan-Indian, so-called pan-Indian Puranas, right? So I think that what really, of course, apart from looking at other more regional sources of information, what one really needs to do is, how did these Puranic stories or epic stories get permuted, transformed, translated, and localized, right? This is one way in which one can counter this sort of massive monolithization and creation of history based on these so-called critical editions. Now, see, what I have been trying to suggest is that the making of this, I call it the fragile archive, precisely because of that reason. Because it is so fragile, it doesn't even touch a tip of the iceberg of what we are, right? It is creating a kind of an imagined world, when in fact the text that you're using to create that imagined world and write written down. There's this very nice North American American Indian scholar who says that we hate writing because it does so much of injustice to us, right? And therefore memory and the continuous retention of memory. Memory can also be fragile, but to create memory into an archive and then use it to write history, to close all other aspects of visualizing the past, is problematic. So there I agree with you, and there are many things over here. So if you want me to read,
yes.
You want to read them out, or should I read them out?
Yeah.
So
you can read yourself and respond to them. Yeah.
So I'll go to the top. There's somebody who's written saying that learned a lot when we categorize ancient texts under certain categories of literature, biography, etc. Does it not become, as you had raised, subjected to only few of the texts which were explored and translated, while many texts remain not translated? Hence, isn't there a possibility of submerging categories? Where exactly do we draw these borders, if borders themselves are being contested? Well, good. Yes, I agree. The entire project of ancient Indian history writing is built on the few. I mean, I'll just take the example of the Manusmriti, which is like this monumental text on the basis of which the entire understanding of the ancient system of caste and varna is built. Nobody ever touches the other smritis, which were written after him, contesting some of the views that he did. The entire Buddhist tradition, which contests the ways in which this is, the same goes with the epic tradition, same goes with biographies. There are innumerable biographies, historical biographies in regional contexts that maybe the regional histories know about or have translated into regional languages, but which we don't know about. And therefore, obviously, borders are continually being contested. Then followed by another question, if one follows upon the idea that the oral tradition and texts like the Puranas and epics are dynamic sources of the past because they are affected by discursive practices of the state, and authors are interpolated individuals, Althusserian term, then how can one construct past? Or will it just be another permutation of a past based merely on how a historian sees such sources? Well, yes, of course, you know, there are many people who have, there is no escape from history, as they say, because there is no escape from the way in which we define our modernity, because history is a sign of the modern. So what really did these societies do? And I don't really mean the dominant Brahmanical discourse or the dominant Buddhist discourse. I think a lot of societies didn't give much importance to history as a way of looking at the past. They were concerned about the present, and they were concerned about issues of morality. They were concerned about issues of the philosophies of life. There's a translation of the Mahabharata, which I can share with you by Badrinath Chaturvedi, which is about the Mahabharata on the human condition. And in the human condition, we are really talking about everyday life. We are talking about women. We are talking about servants. We are talking about excluded castes. We are talking about violence. We are talking about all the issues of everyday life that we confront. So that these texts are not about history. These texts are about remembering the past. So what a historian does is that he uses them, or she uses them, to structure a certain worldview that becomes codified. And it's that codified view of the world that becomes problematic. So therefore, all that historians do is have combinations and permutations and rereadings from a different ideological perspective. And that's all that we have been doing so far. Somebody, Vishnu, to everybody, is saying that he has two questions. Why should we give overemphasis on the sources which can reveal potentially distorted facts for the construction of the past? Can we do parallels for the concept of collective memory in the psyche of John Locke? You see, this is a very important and critical question. You see, when you're saying distorted facts of the construction of the past, who is creating the distorted facts? When we are using memory to create a fact, the problem is with modernity, with the modern enterprise of creating a text. The text was not creating the fact. The text was remembering its present to understand its past and its present condition. So when we talk, so collective memory is something that we can discuss. Collective memory depends, it varies. We can talk in civilizational terms, we can say, okay, there is a collective consciousness. But actually, collective consciousness is very much a collective consciousness of a community or of an entity, of a smaller group. And therefore, they can be autonomous, but I don't think they remain autonomous, because consciousness always travels to the other. Without a dependence on the other, you cannot understand the self. There has to be a natural dependence on the other. And this is where we have a problem. We tend to want to have a kind of very narcissist understanding of the self, and history enables us to have that narcissist understanding of the self, because we exclude everybody that is not in history. Actually, the being dependent on the other. A dependent on the other's consciousness gives rise to a collective consciousness. So there are these various consciousnesses that develop into what Donna Haraway would say, a networking of consciousnesses. And it is that that gives a civilizational collective consciousness. And I think in that sense, there is a subcontinental collective consciousness, which we don't talk much about, we deny it, or we put it within the frame or a framework of a false knowledge or whatever. Then there is my question from Orisha, how to connect these historical information and writings with them who are being culturally, literally, politically ignored and excluded. Yes, I would say that counter history is based on memory of these excluded groups should also be brought to the forefront. They should also be debated. They should also be put on the table. The process of the, as I told Bangaya, the process of the making of critical editions of the Purana, etc., makes the historian very privileged in excluding these other histories, because now we say that because of those critical editions, all these other histories are not important or they are less important. So my argument is that these so-called less important, at some point in time, even the pan-Indian memories were less important.
One second, let me fix this problem, Professor Aloka. 1 second.
Varghese, who is that? Can you block?
Yeah, this is Pavitra.
Yeah.
She
So
is knowing it unknowingly.
Okay.
Okay, so to this question, therefore, culturally, literally, and politically ignored or excluded groups, one has to look at see, I started by saying Black Lives Matter and the creation of an archive of the oral, right? I mean, this is exactly what I meant. The challenging thing is to create the so-called archives, however fragile they are, of the excluded. And this is a project that is necessary and should be made and is in, I think, in some quarters in the process in the making. From Bhatinda, Punjab, what was the relationship between political power and literary culture, especially Satya? Yes, of course, there was a close relationship between political power and the literary culture. In the second half, when we were looking at biographies and when we were looking at prashastis of inscriptions, clearly the literary culture was embedded in the court of kings, and this was a generation of the ideology of the courtly, of kings and people in power to create their own history. The inscriptions which we reject, the prashastis which we reject, is a way of writing their history. They are articulating their own notion of history, and they're putting it on the table, and they are saying, look, please remember our history in terms of our mythical and itihasic connection, and we are very different from the localities in which we are ruling. So they distance themselves from where they are ruling, and they adopt or they adapt to literary cultures which are not of that region. So Temchang Wabin, back again. Dear Professor Aloka, with regard to memory being particular about remembering a collective past, does it imply the possibility of drawing objective conclusions from these collective memories? What if these objective conclusions were being fabricated to make them sound true? All memory is rooted in subjectivity. It is rooted in experience. So the question of making it objective doesn't arise. It's history that makes canonization of this memory objective. It becomes an objective data for us. So memory itself is subjective. The memory is created out of the individual. Why do they remember is the question that we have to ask. What was if I go back to the epics, what was the purpose of the writing the Mahabharata or the Ramayana? What was the purpose writing a history? Or are we the ones wanting to search for a narrative history over there and then create problems for ourselves in the contemporary times? So no, memory is not about objective conclusion. Memory is, yes, of course, it is fabricated and subjective, and the community chooses what it wants to remember. And it's about subjective experience. Now, it is your subjective experience and then it's my subjective experience. All these subjective experiences should be brought onto the table, but they should be discussed, debated, and written about. Why should there be a unilinear voice of using a canonized text to write the history from one version or one standpoint? And that one standpoint gets written about and therefore becomes the word authoritative word. As you stated, Itihas represents collective historical consciousness of early India. When we are contextualizing multiple parochial versions of Itihases, there comes a possibility of the intervention of cultural memory of individual memories. So can we treat Itihas as collective memory as a source? No, I just answered that question. Yes. When the word itihas is used, first of all, itihas is used in many Indian languages to try and tell us that this is history. What I'm trying to say is that when we use itihas, let us remember that we are talking about a collective historical consciousness, and this collective historical consciousness can be contextualized locally, regionally. Now, the intervention of cultural memory into the collective historical, there is an umbilical cord relationship between the two. So that there are sensibilities about our cultural memory, which I referred to in the end, about this rule-boundedness of Indian society, which is a very authoritative way of controlling the past. And that is something that definitely has to be questioned, because there have to be attempts to critique the way this cultural memory came into our midst, and why is it continually being resurrected again and again? Why is it that cultural memory is being resurrected again and again, and not only in the past, but also in the present? Whereas Itihasic, Puranic, or other collective historical traditions, these have a totally different purpose. They have a purpose wherein issues, like let's say in a small Adivasi community, when a collective historical consciousness of the community is brought in, it raises issues about the authenticity of themselves, their identity, their notions of justice, their notions of who are the others, their notion about their philosophy of life, their notion about violence, and all these other issues. And I think that I think it's high time that we have to problematize the different cultural consciousness, the different historical consciousnesses that we have, because to only privilege the one means that we are writing all these other consciousnesses out of history. And so my endeavor has been, let us make attempts to not resurrect Itihas Puran of the Ganges Valley, but to have various Itihas Purans discussed, debated, written about, and therefore write a whole lot of local histories which contest, agree, distort, transform, or do whatever else to the so-called pan-Indian understandings. Another issue is that with hierarchy of memories, Brahmanic, tribal, how can we rationally approach issues related to the extraction of multiple memories, starting from textual interpolation? And yeah, I just answered this in the sense that we cannot hierarchize memories. I think that I have elsewhere written about the whole question of how diversity has to be celebrated. And now I'm not saying that romanticize diversity, because then in that sense there is we are sort of only giving ourselves up to what most historians are worried about a kind of a transcendental understanding of the past, and that is not rooted in reality. I think that in India we have a great opportunity to look at local realities, and therefore these local realities, they extract multiple memories starting from and when critical additions were made, they removed these interpolations. When Sultankar looked at the Mahabharata in some 12,000 type of editions and oral and others written traditions, he was removing interpolations. Now, by removing interpolations, you're removing some people out of history, right? These people interpolated because that was the necessity of that particular recension, right? isn't it? So I think that this question of hierarchization of memories is not called for, and I don't think I would agree with that. And like, can I go on and on and on? I mean, or should we end?
Yeah, you can take 2-3 questions, ma'am, and then we'll end.
On at 7:37, some days are.
Yeah, yeah. Pick up important one.
I would like to ask you that do you think the regional production of visual narratives found in various monumental sites can help to understand how the people of the past in a certain period experience and represent their lived experience of the past? Does it help to fill the gap of pan-Indian meta-narrative of the past? Nextly, colonial intervention in the production of knowledge since the 18th century denied the existence of indigenous ways of remembering the past by various communities. It ruptured the indigenous process of remembering the past. Do archaeological remains and visual help us to throw light? Yes, of course, but I would say one thing that the visual narratives on monumental sites are historical statements of how that memory has been encrypted onto the locality. So I have very good examples of that, and I have looked at visual traditions, but we can talk about that somewhere else. But it is very important to look at these visual representations, because in these visual representations, there is a concrete way of trying to understand how the remembered tradition is understood by the people or the communities or the regions that are encrypting it. And yes, of course, because of this colonial intervention, we lost our indigenous ways of remembering. And therefore, today in our classrooms and today in our day-to-day understanding of history, we totally ignore the indigenous process of remembering, because we look at it as a false knowledge. It's a knowledge system that we have nothing to do with. Maybe it governs our private lives. Maybe orality is important in understanding ourselves as independent groups in different castes and communities and regions, but it's got nothing to do with our modern selves and our public selves, so to speak. So therefore, I don't know whether one should simply resurrect that into the public space, but I think there has to be a very careful, continuous negotiation between the notions of remembering and what it means for a society, rather than simply putting myth as we understand it in the modern sense to the forefront of the debates about history. Because I don't think that the purpose of myth was to resurrect a fact or truth of the past. It was simply to try and understand the notions of philosophical notions of justice or life or whatever else was being discussed. So I think we have to be very careful in the way in which we bring back these notions of well, at a national level and so on and so forth. And then Shadnik, maybe I'll take this as the last question. How do we liberate these integral philological practices pursuing for proofs to look beyond and open up the possibilities of the others? Well, one of the most important ways in which one can do that is to perhaps relook at meanings. I'm all for I mean, there's no one way of looking at Itihas or Puran or Gatha or whatever. And I would be very happy to, go back and take a look at these terms again and try and understand what were indeed the different terms that were used and why were they used in particular contexts. Because after all these terms for looking at the past were located in particular points in time. And so therefore, the only way in which we can liberate ourselves from rigid meanings that have been given to these terms is to go back and relook at these words and then open up possibilities of how they can. Maybe perhaps we can reopen these debates by creating new archives or creating new oral narratives that do not come from these practices, right? If we start with the regional
Varghese, I think ma'am is muted. Unmute her.
Yeah, please unmute and speak. Yes, there is a slight problem with your bandwidth, but please continue.
Okay, I'll come closer. Is it a dangerous says, what does she say? Dangerous to club moral by history. So I'm not saying that the certitudes that modern day morality, what I'm saying is that when we look at memory is about moral certitudes. So that all the mythic tales that we tell ourselves or we hear about, etc., they explore philosophies. They explore questions. They explore questions about is violence legitimate? Is the burning of forests the right thing to be done or not? Are there various ways in which composite identities of people, how should they be discussed? So there are innumerable such questions that disturb us even today. They disturb the people in the past as well. So it depends on when you're using this word history. If you're using this word history to understand it in the way we understand it today, I think that's problematic. But what I was saying was that when we look at remembering the past, then there are no certitudes about what is certain, what is definite. What there is a certitude about is that we should be understanding what is moral or what is justice and what is our philosophy of life and so on and so forth. So that's it. I think that's the end.
Okay.
I don't know whether I took all the questions. I started somewhere in the middle. But thank you very much. But I'm sorry if I have not addressed all the questions. And we can always carry on a conversation in other fora.
Okay. Thank you so much, ma'am, for the wonderful lecture. Now I request my colleague, Dr. Varghese, to propose a formal vote of thanks. Varghese.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
So it has always been a pleasure and fascinating to listen to Professor Aloka talking history, and today it was just another fascinating day. And I particularly liked the manner in which she ended, connecting it with the present, where she advocated heterogeneity and variety in the place of hierarchy as well as authenticity. And she also advocated that a text should not be treated as a closed text, but it should actually treat as a key to multitude of possibilities, right? But at the same time, I was very interested to see the distinction that she was actually making between capturing the past and claiming the past. There is one way of making multiple claims to past, but at the same time, there is also another way of capturing the past. But obviously, that's a difficult task, right? And the challenge ahead of the historian is to actually understand where is and who is and in what context this capturing and claims are actually happening, and to understand the politics of it very clearly. Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you so much, Professor Aloka, for agreeing to speak and doing this fascinating talk. And thank you all for joining us on this webinar. I have one announcement before I sign off. From the next week onwards, we will meet on Thursday instead of Friday. We will have this webinar on Thursday evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you.